Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session on Deaf in Tech. This is such a beautiful San Francisco day. I drove across the Golden Gate Bridge to get here, and it just added to my excitement for being here with you today. So let's get started. Let me introduce our panelists. We have an amazing group of people here. I'm so honored to be sharing the stage with them. Next to me is Eli Rossiter. She works at Slack, where she is an iOS QA engineer. And she's also a woman of mystery.
Hi.
Next to her, we have William Albright.
Hey there.
What do you think? Yeah, he's Eugene to some people. He's an engineer. He also is he races. He's a competitive cyclist. How's that been going for you?
Hello.
Next to him, we have Will Johannson, who is an engineer at Pandora. He loves roller coasters. So I do too, so I'm glad we're both here today. And then finally, we have K.R. Liu, who's the Director of Accessibility and Advocacy at Doppler Labs. She's a tech exec here, and has been so in the Silicon Valley for 20 years, which is quite an accomplishment. She's also on the board of the Hearing Loss Association of America, from LA. And she has a twin sister who doesn't have any hearing loss, which I think is pretty cool. So, we're here today to have a conversation with each other and with you about deaf people in the tech industry. There are so many different ways to be deaf. Each of us has a unique story, a unique perspective and background. There isn't only one way to be deaf. Some people may have grown up going to a school for the deaf. Some people may have gone only to public schools. They may have been the only deaf person in an otherwise all-hearing school. They may have had some deaf students in the class with them. Any different constellation of school classroom you can think of, that's where deaf people can be found. Some sign, some don't. Some learn sign from a very, very young age. Some never saw or learned sign language until they were already adults. Some people are what we call oral, meaning they only speak and don't sign. I myself am profoundly deaf, and I learned sign language when I was very young, in school and from my parents, especially Mom. Love you, Mom. So I'd like to go down and have each panelist introduce themselves and mention something about their background, how they learned sign language, what communication method is best for them, what kind of people were around you growing up, and were you the only deaf person in your family? So let's start with Eli.
Hi, I'm Eli. I was actually born hearing, and I became sick with meningitis when I was 1. And from that point on, I was profoundly deaf, like Bobby. I also didn't use hearing aids. They didn't work for me. Fortunately, my parents decided to learn sign language, and so they put me into an oral program. Instead of learning sign language, they put me in an oral...
No, instead of moving to an oral program, they learned sign language.
My parents did learn sign, and they put me in an education program where other people signed. It was in a mainstream public environment, actually near here in San Rafael. So that's where I was raised. I went to the University of Santa Cruz, where I completed my education with the support of sign language interpreters. So that's a little bit about me.
Great, so I was born deaf, in a hearing family, and I went to a deaf school, a completely deaf school when I was 3, and then I went to Gallaudet University, which is also a deaf school. I have been signing ASL the whole time since I was a child, and I tend to use interpreters or write back and forth. I have no usable hearing. I grew up in Southern California. I went to the California School for the Deaf in Riverside, California.
I was born deaf, and my aunt, luckily, and dad, my dad's sister, they actually went to Gallaudet University, just as the university that William mentioned. So they had brought many deaf friends over to our family, so I was in contact with members of the deaf community. So when I was born, they found out that I was deaf. it was an easy decision that I would be using. They would teach me ASL from birth on, and I could still use that method of communication with my family members who, like my brother who is not deaf. But I have, and I was mainstreamed, and I have always been able to be able to communicate via the use of interpreters. I went to college at Rochester Institute of Technology over in New York. And there's probably about 1,000 deaf people who go to school there, and I learned computer science, and I have been working with computers ever since.
I'm KR. I have very, very severe hearing loss. When I was born 38 years ago, there was no deaf school. I went to a mainstream school. I got my hearing loss because I was born 3 months premature, so I was 1.5 pounds when I was born. My twin. So we were very lucky to survive. We grew up here in the Bay Area, and I went straight through mainstream school. My way of communicating was mostly through reading lips. And I basically had to figure out how to adapt and communicate with people. I didn't have technology to help me. I didn't have the option of learning ASL as a choice. I had to basically figure it out on my own. And so I grew up in Silicon Valley, and right when I was a senior in high school, the first .com boom started happening, and I got an internship at a tech company doing tech support, believe it or not. Worked my way up into different sales and marketing executive positions. Over the last 20 years, in the last few years, I've worked in tech companies that are looking at different ways of integrating wearable tech into how to help people with different disabilities. So now I do a lot of work doing advocacy work and pushing some regulation changes on Capitol Hill to get more accessible technology to people who need it.
Great. Thank you for that. So as you can see, we have varied backgrounds up here on the stage, various educational opportunities, various experiences with language. One common thread that I've noticed, however, is that people who went to a mainstream program used interpreters, and people who went to the schools for the deaf still were in programs that were funded by the federal government, according to the provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we had interpreters in mainstream schools, or you go to a state school for the deaf that receives government funding. So that just shows that we've had a little bit more of a challenge having getting our education growing up. And I do want to make sure that one thing you leave here with is that there is no one way to be deaf. You've just seen we have varied backgrounds, and that has implications for inclusion. So I think I'll just go right ahead and dive in with the first question.
That's fine.
So something that I've seen a lot here and I've heard mentioned a lot in the last few years is to bring your whole self to work. So what would that mean, to bring your full self, your whole identity? Is it your ethnic background? Is it just, what does that encompass? What parts of you do you feel comfortable bringing, and what parts do you have to leave at the door? So with your varied backgrounds, I wanted to ask you what your experience has been like trying to bring your full self into the workplace. And anyone who would like to start can lead us off.
Sure.
KR?
For a long time, I hid my hearing loss at work. I didn't want it to keep me from getting promoted or anyone to treat me differently. I just did everything I could to act normal until it became too difficult, right? And I started to have to say, okay, I have to be honest about who I am, and if people aren't going to accept that, that's their problem, not my problem. So I'm trying to put myself out there to see if they're willing to adapt to help me. And that was a really difficult thing to do. But more and more I did that, the more and more I saw people were accepting and willing to help so that I could do my job better, and even did that in my personal life. And that was really difficult to do, but by me doing that, it made them more comfortable to do the same.
Yeah, to be able to bring your whole self to work, it is a little bit complicated. I'm deaf, and that means not only a different culture, but how I get information is different. How I am in a place. So I can bring myself to work. In order for me to do that, I have to do a lot of work beforehand just to get that job. Depending on the company culture, is the culture of the people supportive to provide interpreters at work? Do they have a budget for interpreters, for accommodations? Not only that, what are the people at that company like during an interview? Are they really interested in who I am as a person, or they start asking questions about my language? If I end up working for that company, it's a lot easier for me to socialize with the members of the company if they make an effort to be able to communicate with me. Oftentimes I'm the only deaf person in that company. I'm the only one there. So it can be hard. So if there's any after hours activities for a company, I'm often left out and end up going straight home. If they were open to involve me all the way from the interview process to an after hours program at work, that's the only way I'd be able to bring my whole self at work and be able to participate fully.
Eli?
It's interesting, some of the threads that are coming. I think a couple of us can kind of pass as far as what that experience is. We kind of exist between a couple of different worlds, maybe our experience in the hearing world and so forth. So I can kind of lip read and can engage people in that sort of speech if I want, but I am profoundly deaf. And so to be able to bring my full self to work, I really, like William was saying, I have to do some background work. I have to prepare first. I have to make sure that I, am prepared before I arrived. That I can, when I do arrive, that there's that kind of, that they're greeted with my preparation. That I come that way. There's a kind
Sometimes that's all they see.
Sometimes that's all they see is that I'm deaf, and so to pass in a situation like that, how do I bring my full self there?
Mm-hmm. Will? So
I would like to add that you're right, like as William mentioned, like the whole process, it's that whole process. It's not just, okay, we have interpreters for the interview and that's it and that's great, but there is a process after that. So I have to feel like I can be a part of your company. And to be a part of your company means that I need to be happy to engage with everybody. And so when I was hired at my workplace, the people there were really interested in learning sign language, and so there was enough interest, so we decided to establish an opportunity to teach ASL to the colleagues, and that way they had more of an ability to converse with me and sign with me. And there's also things like the use of Slack. We use Slack for work, and that's another option as well, which is fine, but it's just there are different preferences out there, and if the company is willing to match your preferences, then that is really vital, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Now, Eli, you'd said something that I'd like to expand on a little bit. As she said that often all people can see is that she's deaf, or it's the first thing they see, and it's the first way they experience her. So I wanted to ask you a little bit to say how that impacts you in the workplace. And the others can answer that as well if it feels applicable.
Well, I think it really depends on the company culture, first of all. If the company culture supports inclusion, and that's from the ground up, that really makes a big difference. And at Slack, I feel like it's a communication platform company that's infused into the workplace. However, to expand that to beyond just meetings, maybe inviting me to speak and bringing different types of support and accommodations, captioning or interpreters, and kind of adjusting the style so that the whole space can be open to that. And I don't know if there's quite the platform in some places to be able to support that type technology for meetings, but sometimes it involves just even one-on-one conversations where people are communicating clearly. I'm thinking of a coworker who's working on a project, and they had been invited me to participate in that meeting as well, and so I think tech has these great tools. We have these great tools, but there's also this this kind of bias.
So how this impacts me at work, that's the question. So really, people often look at me just like as a robot. Maybe I code, I get there, and they realize, oh wait, hey, you go to music festivals, you smoke pot, you are just like me, you're a normal person. You're just a regular, you're just like me, not just this robot who comes to work and leaves, Once they realize that, I'm able to come out and they see more than just me as a deaf person. So the deafness no longer becomes as important.
For me, it's important to be able to show who I am. I can't just be that deaf guy. I want them to know me as a person who programs, a person who has many talents, not just the deaf guy and who, he's that special one. I want them to look at me as a normal person.
I think for me, how it affects me is if people don't know right away that I have any kind of hearing loss, they're calling my name from behind, or there's a conversation happening and I'm not paying attention, they think I'm ignoring them, I'm being rude, or I have some problem with them. And sometimes I have to be aware of that, and the fact that I read lips has made it great for me because I can read body language really, really well. So I can sense if something's off. And usually I'll go to that person and be like, just so we're clear, I probably didn't hear you that day, And that's actually served me well in my career. I'm able to read body language in a business deal and tell if the words that person's saying is really what they're thinking, right? I can see beyond that, which has been a great asset, and I've actually used that as a strength. So I think it served me well.
Great, thank you for that. It's a lot of food for thought. That idea of being seen as the deaf person is, first of all, what do people actually see when they see you as the deaf person? Some people just see you as someone who's lost their hearing. You can't hear, you can't do this, you can't do that. But do you start your life as an infant? Oh, and when we start our lives as infants, we have hearing tests typically, and parents get told, oh, your child failed the hearing test. It starts with the language there and continues throughout. There isn't any way to really expand parents' experiences to meeting the deaf community or seeing all the things that we as deaf people are and can do. You'll see a lot of hashtags on Facebook and Twitter, the hashtag DeafGain, G-A-I-N, DeafGain, and that's a new concept that's gaining traction in our community. Captioning is, for example, was initially seen as solely for the deaf and hard of hearing, but now we're seeing it's a lot of people who hear benefit from it because they're either in loud situations or the sound is turned off for some reason, they can still follow a program on the television. One thing that comes up quite commonly is that deaf people are really expert communicators. We've had to be. We've been in so many situations in our lives where we were the ones that had to take on responsibility for communicating, which has led to a toolkit, a communication toolkit that allows us to move around the world. If you drop a deaf person off in the middle of any country in the world, we'll communicate, we'll make it work. Trust me. So, actually, to see if anybody has any thoughts to add to that.
Definitely. Actually, I was going to talk about that, being dropped in another country. I've traveled the world. I love to travel. And just last year, I went to Istanbul, Turkey last year. And before that, I went to Germany. Before that, I went to France. I've been to a lot of places. So when I face a situation where I'm trying to communicate with somebody, it's easy for me to write back and forth because that becomes a way to learn their language too. Often that's what happens, and I can just jump right in and communicate with people, and you have to. It's kind of a necessity. So that's definitely something that we do all the time.
Yep. So that's part of what you'll see discussed when the hashtag #DeafGain is used. Now I wanted to ask you, in what ways technology companies in specific benefit from #DeafGain when they hire deaf employees?
Yeah, I'll answer that. I think one obvious example that you may be able to relate to is Facebook just sent out a new feature where they have live video, and you're able to show your likes, and they'll stream the likes and emotions in real time, which is kind of awesome, but that's covering the captions. So for those of us watching live feeds, we can't read the caption. So if deaf people were included, that would have never happened at Facebook. They would have realized the accessibility issue right away. They would have realized a member of their team wasn't able to get access to the caption. So you have been able to eliminate the problem from the get-go and save money right away.
And to add to that, that's one example, but growing up, I was always interested in different languages. So, and learning about the technology behind the app and how an app would become accessible, and to have accessibility features on an iPhone or language translations. That requires, for example, like German. They're famous for their words to be super long. How's that going to fit on the screen? So that type of thing is to learn about those factors and to bring that knowledge to work. Because there's a lot of people who are just writing English programs, and their UI is fixed to the English language. But that's not going to be, that becomes a barrier when you're trying to use other languages. So I've noticed problems like that in some projects, and I bring it to their attention saying, hey, we need to look at X, Y, and Z first, when they're just coming up with a Band-Aid and I'm trying to come up with a true fix, a full process. And I'm looking at the whole process and seeing how it's going to work in the end, as opposed to just having to come up with a quick fix at the end when they're just trying to save money. So that's what, with the whole hashtag #DeafGain, that's also part of saving money.
I have something to add. I'd say that, back to that idea of being seen deaf as a deaf person first. I think that it promotes this kind of understanding that that your company has diversified or has been considering diversity, and I think that really we should consider encouraging people to move in the direction of universal understanding of human beings. And so if we incorporate that idea into design, and that perspective is there from the get-go, and we're thinking of that in all the situations we're engaging, in computers and tech, I think that people will naturally incorporate those other perspectives as a part of it.
Wow, you're making me think here.
I would like to add to that. Bobby and I were talking about this earlier. There's this perception that you either have perfect hearing or you're deaf. It's very black and white. Most people don't realize that hearing's on a spectrum, right? And we communicate all very differently, whether you have mild, moderate hearing loss, some hearing loss, or you're deaf and you communicate in a different way. And I think people forget that, right? And I've had many people come to me and say, actually I have hearing issues, I don't talk about it. Well, why don't you talk about it? Well, there's a stigma associated to that. And that's something I've never understood, why there's such a stigma around that. Why is hearing so stigmatized? I mean, people wear glasses if they can't see. It's hip and cool to wear glasses. So why aren't we changing the perception of what it means to hear and hear differently? There should be no stigma around that.
Thank you. That's very thought-provoking, as the other comments were as well. Well, first of all, I'll have to admit that I'm not perfect. But I think all of us can fall into the trap of exceptionalism. Oh, you're deaf, that means you're really good at this or you're really good at that, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's an important point to explore more. And I'm wondering if any of you have any more thoughts about that.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to piggyback on what KR was saying. I think that as regarding stigma relating to communication, it's really important. I think people are used to communicating in a certain way. And so when they get used to that groove, it's very hard to get out of it and to think about, approaching it in a different way.
Yeah, that sounds right. No other comments? Okay, then I'll move on. The unfortunate reality is that there are not that many deaf people in the tech field. So we were talking earlier, and I'm going to ask all of you to share your thoughts on this, about how it is we can expand that pipeline. There are a number of deaf people already in the pipeline working at tech companies in the Bay Area and around the world. But how can tech companies do better on that other end of the pipeline to get more deaf people started into it? And then how can they improve their recruiting and hiring processes? Do you all have any thoughts on how to solve problems on either end of the pipeline?
I do, yes. Honestly, I'm not 100% no, hold on, let me go back. The CEO of Pinterest mentioned that one way to motivate tech companies to implement diversity is to tell them that it is valuable for your company, for your product and your business. It is profitable. And I'm not convinced that it's a guaranteed way to encourage them. I mean, some companies can, for example, it could apply to other situations, going to RIT, going to schools, going to the deaf school here in Fremont, going to Southern California School for the Deaf in Riverside, to set up a program to teach kids how to code. I mean, it's that same type of relationship. I think the problem is just it's hard to put a number on it. I mean, sure, if we hire deaf people, maybe that might make our business grow and be more diverse, but what does that do for our bottom line? It's really hard to produce numbers for that. So to be honest, I'm still not 100% convinced.
Adding on that, you brought up a good point about the the role models that we were talking about before. You'd asked me, and I was thinking about it. I was really lucky to have kind of fallen into tech. I feel like that's a good fit for me, and I'm a third generation tech worker. My grandfather and my father were both in tech, and so it seemed a bit natural to fall into that field. And so when it was presented, when you talked about presenting today, I thought, of course, that would be right in line with my experience. But I also think that I think of children, and I think of them not having the role models, deaf children not having the role models that they need to come up through the pipeline, as we were talking about.
So we have the pipeline of a company who's trying to figure out the best process for that. Like I said before, there's the whole holistic approach from the beginning at the interview, having interpreters for that, maybe. Or maybe if instead you can use the computer to type back and forth during the interview. The important thing is to ask the question to the deaf person of what they want. What communication style works best for them? Have that at the beginning and let that continue throughout the course of them working there, while they're at work, making sure that their communication needs have been met all the while when they're working there, and make sure that there is some outreach being done as well. For example, like what William was saying, building those relationships with different companies, having educational backgrounds, varied educational backgrounds. Like Eli was saying, she was raised in a tech family, basically, and my family is not super into tech, so my dad was an artist, and but so to have the access to computers, though, that helps a lot. And maybe there's a company that wants to encourage diversity, such as William was talking about, like going to various schools and have funding for computers and computer classes, and learning programming, that kind of stuff. It's the holistic approach. It's not just the hiring process and working in this one area, but it's the whole shebang.
Anyone else want to add anything? No? Okay. Thank you for that. You're giving me too much to think about. I'm learning stuff today here too. But we're here to talk about tech. Now we have video, we have chat in various forms, a lot of different ways to break down the traditional communication barriers. Slack has been a wonderful tool. I use it myself all the time. However, tech also brings with it some of the same old communication issues. I've tried to use the Oculus Rift. I can't lip read the avatars. I can't hear, I can't lip read the avatars, so then what do? So that actually increases a barrier. Tech events often don't provide the accessibility resources, or the resources I'm expected to use aren't accessible. So how can the tech industry improve the story around access? I mean, this event right here is one example perhaps, but what else is there?
I think one positive improvement is that the company has to think the long game. They have to hire deaf people, and I think that eventually will ingrain itself in the company, that culture. It's really hard for a company to, just ask what the needs are. They need to learn that from hiring deaf individuals. And also, do A/B testing, test around, ask questions. For example, I forgot my example. Let's save time. Will?
So you were talking about how hiring people can become, that provides more outreach, if you will. I work at Pandora, and I used to work at Rdio, and gone to different conferences, and there's always accessibility for me. But that's a good point, is that when you work for a company, that means I go to these conferences, and the more deaf people that work there, the more conferences that will need to be attended and need to be accessible. So that's a good way to get that knowledge out there to others. And also,
Oculus Rift. You got it.
Going back to the Oculus Rift, that becomes a problem with people because of design, the design of the product. It's designed for hearing people first, instead of having people who are aware of the different situations that are needed. Which situations, like how can you make certain situations accessible, or all situations accessible for a blind person or for somebody who's having some sight issues. So just the ability to, like mentioned before, I mean, it's all about the process, really. You have to have inclusion in every step of the way. And how do we get technology to help everyone, not just as you're saying, just as what you're saying here.
I also think it's really important. I've always said, and I've worked in many hardware companies, that when you design for disability, you design for everyone. So if you start thinking that way first, and look at the problem you're trying to solve and the solution you're trying to provide, usually that's going to apply to everyone across the spectrum. So it's really important to maybe change the perspective. And if you see companies that are leaving out a different demographic or not looking at the whole picture, reach out and tell them, right? Write them a letter, send them an email, call them. I've had people contact me at companies going, I have this issue. If you could add this feature, it would be so much better. It would help so many people. So I think it's important that on both sides we communicate that.
Yeah, I'd like to add.
Well, actually, to follow up with KR, if I may. You work at Doppler Labs. And I was wondering if you can come up with a specific example of what you just mentioned. How products are designed from the get-go. Actually, it's universal design principles that we're talking about, right?
Yeah, so Doppler Labs creates 2 wireless earbuds that allow you to control how you hear the world. And the product was originally created for you to EQ your live music environment. And when they launched the product, they got thousands of letters from people that say, I have autism, I have PTSD, I have hearing loss, I have hearing sensitivities. It would be great if you added these features to make the product help me live a better life, right? And the founders were like, we know nothing about this arena, and they reached out to me and said, hey, we need help. We need help on how can we take a look at how we might position our product or even consider adding these feature sets that can help people live a better life. And they took that initiative. They went and reached out. So, and that's why I joined the company, because of the potential in the technology, and that they were really serious about including everyone across the spectrum in allowing them to use the product. So, I mean, for me, that was really why I took the role. And even in the company before that, I worked for Pebble, which is a smartwatch company, and I did a collaboration with Starkey Hearing, so that when my hearing aids need to be controlled by my smartphone, I didn't want to pull out my phone in a meeting. It looked really rude. So I helped them create an app so that I could control it from my smartwatch, and nobody knew that that's what I was doing. So again, you take technology that I need to function in the world and technology that everybody uses, and it kind of blends in, right? And you start to change that conversation about technology inclusion.
Inclusion and diversity has such a great impact, even on just from product development. So I think we have time left for one more comment. Eli?
You know, I think KR covered a lot of the points I was just going to say.
Okay.
I did want to add something. I think it is true, not only related to products, but events, really like tech events, are not accessible to deaf people. One simple thing is for having a company have a system ready. For example, on the website for an event, already have a request form for accessibility. So if a person goes to the website, they already have an easy form that they can fill out instead of having to dig through an email, contacting a person directly, not knowing what to do, having to go around the whole system to be able to get their accessibility and watch it break down. So having an easy form, or just something, if there's any accessibility issue, to have a process to go straight to a person that they need to contact, instead of just some random person in the company that may not have any idea about what accessibility needs might be for that company's product. So having that all ready to begin with, because it's impossible to imagine everything beforehand.
See this font of wisdom we have up here? I would like to thank Eli, William, Will, and KR for joining us today. I really, really appreciated you taking the time. Let's give them a round of applause. This is the way you do it. Great, thank you.